Welcome to Kansas Ag Report. I'm Ken Rogers. On this week's program, due to the weather and some other factors, we're going to have one of our better interviews so far this year. That is when we talk with Dr. Richard Linton, the president of Kansas State University. We did catch up with him right before the spring semester started. Of course, now we're in spring break, but wanted to again talk about all the good things going on the campus in Manhattan and around the K-State system. We'll also have features from Kansas Corn, Kansas Wheat, and the Kansas Farm Bureau, and the weekly update from the Kansas Livestock Association and market information from Pinion.
Kansas Ag Report brought to you in part by the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by Kansas farmers. Kansas Farm Bureau, a grassroots ag organization representing the state's farm and ranch families since 1919. KFB.org. And the Kansas Wheat Commission, lending in the adoption of profitable innovations from wheat. Online at kswheat.com.
Senate Ag Committee Chair John Bozeman said he and his House counterpart in the early stages of deciding how to move parts of the Farm Bill into reconciliation. Bozeman met with House Ag Chair G.T. Thompson this week to discuss potentially moving risk management provisions from the Farm Bill into reconciliation, with the Senate introducing its latest budget blueprint Wednesday afternoon of this week. Bozeman said there are still a long way to go from finalizing the details, but GOP leaders hope to get a budget resolution through the Senate sometime here over the weekend. The blueprint sets vast different spending cut goals, that is, for the ag committees. The House expected to find at least $230 billion in cuts over the next 10 years. Senate counterpart will only be required to cut as little as $1 billion. President Donald Trump this week announced a new 10% across-the-board tariff in addition to reciprocal duties that will be applied to specific trade partners like China, the European Union, Japan, and South Korea. At an event at the Rose Garden on Wednesday of this week, it was dubbed Make America Wealthy Again. And with his cabinet in attendance, the president asserted that the U.S. had long pursued a trade policy of economic surrender, but said it's now the U.S. to turn and prosper. Accordingly, he said all trading partners will face a new 10% duty, but some will also face higher reciprocal duties than the president said, reflected both in tariff and non-tariff barriers applied to U.S. exports in their markets. That means they do it to us, we do it to them. Very simple, he said. He added that the rate was discounted from the rates that those countries charge. China is set to face reciprocal duties of 34%, European Union facing a rate of 20%, Japan 24%, India 26%, South Korea 25%, according to a White House handout. These duties include a 10% baseline tariff, and the new across-the-board tariffs kick in April 5th, so they're already there, according to the White House. The country-specific reciprocal duties then take place on April 9th. White House fact sheet says the higher reciprocal tariffs were reserved for countries in which the U.S. has had the largest trade deficits. Canada and Mexico, which had already been hit by the new tariffs since Trump took office, will not be affected by the new actions, according to the White House. We'll be back with more coming up in just a moment.
Kansas Ag Report brought to you in part by Kansas Grain Sorghum, growers working together. Learn more at ksgrainsorghum.org. Grass and Grain, online or in the mail, keeping Kansas farmers informed for over 60 years. grassandgrain.com.
And our guest is Dr. Romulo Lollato, who is a wheat and forage system specialist at K-State Research and Extension. Dr. Lollato, always great to catch up with you.
Hi, Ken. Yeah, it's great to be here today.
We're going to kind of get a early spring update on this Kansas winter wheat crop, as now pretty much broken dormancy. We are into spring, and talking to a lot of farmers, they're optimistic right now, but maybe crossing their fingers just to see what happens. But wanted to get your take as you've traveled the state, talked with other producers, looking at other plots. What's your take right now on the status of the Kansas wheat crop?
Yeah, so I have been around the state here in the last month or so a number of times, right, to different events that we were holding and just going out and checking the crop as well. And overall, even though there was a little bit of a concern from those winter events, whether the crop was going to have survived those or not, we were cautiously optimistic at that point in time. And it seems like that was kind of the right feeling to have. Right out of dormancy at the initial green up, we were seeing a few fields that looked a little bit spotty here and there, but it seems like they kind of grew out of that. And part of that was also if we look back at the conditions that the Kansas wheat crop have had so far. The month of November, we had quite a bit of moisture around the state there. So it's kind of like we were getting out of the winter in a pretty decent shape. Even some growers thinking that the crop is kind of maybe too big for this time of the year, especially in those situations when they took advantage of that early September rainfall and kind of got planted on the early side of things, right? Then the month of October was super dry, which allowed us to plant on time, but really a lot of the crop emerged a little bit on the later end when late October, early November, we had all those rains, right? But coming out of the winter right now, overall, the crop is looking good for the most of the state. We see a good looking stands. As I mentioned before, some of the crop looking almost too big or too good, right? At this point, north central, northwest Kansas, we are kind of going from that tillering stage to perhaps upright canopy. Now, somewhere in that transition, we go more towards the south central part of the state. The crop is already well upright and getting to the jointing stages there. And southeast Kansas is well past jointing already, probably second or even getting third node there, close to fleck leaf emergence. Perhaps not quite that far, but heading that way pretty quick. So a large range of stages across the state, also somewhat depending on planting date there. But overall, coming out of the winter, the perspective for the crop is positive, right? It's good. Now, a few things that can complicate that feeling, right, is when we look at the forecast. So essentially, a short-term forecast, if you think like 10 days or so, last I checked, we were at normal, which means 50% chance of getting more rain than usual, 50% chance of getting less rain than usual. And just earlier this week, we got some rain in parts of the state, but really that was a stretch, right? It was kind of like a stretch going in central Kansas there. Now, if we look at a longer term forecast going into early or into the spring and early summer, last I checked was to be drier than normal. So that's never really good news for us, right? Because of course moisture is really what I'm going to drive our yield potential in this region. And so at a longer term forecast to early summer, things are suggesting that we might be below normal in terms of precipitation. So that's always something that we need to keep in mind when we're planning our management for the rest of the crop here. Now, looking at the last 30 days, just what happened in the last 30 days in terms of rainfall, right? Very limited rainfall in southwest Kansas, almost nothing, right? And that kind of extends down to our neighbors down south in Oklahoma and Texas, where the wheat is reported to have been suffering some drought stress over there as well. That also shows up in our stripe rust models. Our stripe rust models, they predict, how likely we are to have epidemics of stripe rust, and those depend a lot on the moisture down south, right? Because that's how the spores of the disease move up from Texas to Oklahoma, Kansas, and so on. Right now, they're showing very low risk. And again, that has a lot to do with what's going on down south in Texas being as dry as they are. So again, right now, the crop is in good shape, but we look at recent moisture here. It has been very limited to that stretch that we got here earlier this week from central Kansas, maybe, Ellsworth area through the northeast part of the state. Other than that, we have not had any significant precipitation as of recently here.
All right. Dr. Romulo Lollato is a wheat and forage system specialist, K-State Research and Extension. We're going to take a break, come back and maybe pinpoint a couple of areas and maybe some things to look out for as this crop continues to mature. We'll do that in just a moment.
Kansas Ag Report brought to you in part by the Kansas Livestock Association, supporting members' business interests and meeting consumer demands. KLA.org. Oldie Seed Farms, carrying soil-specific seed. Find them on the web at oldieseed.com. That's OHLDE seed.com. And Kansas Corn, building the future at kansascorn.com.
And our guest is Dr. Romulo Lollato, who is with K-State Research and Extension. He is the wheat specialist, and we're looking at the wheat crop. Let's maybe focus in on a couple of areas if we do have some concern, because we know there's always a challenge in the western part of the state just because of the lack of moisture. It did in kind of some of our travels, we did see some of this wheat that got tinged a little bit when we had a couple of those cold weather events. But what about that? What about any areas to really look out for? And what about some possible disease pressures or other pressures that might come from some of the challenges they're having, say, down south?
Yeah, so right now, whenever we think of the situation of the Kansas wheat crop, right, in terms of potential for a winter kill, again, it may have been fairly spotty, right, in terms of growers who planted it pretty early and maybe had too much canopy at that point in time, may have suffered some more winter kill. But essentially, I'm in terms of a big picture statewide, I'm not necessarily overly concerned. Right now, my main concern is we put out nitrogen. Probably for the majority of the state, we're done with that operation, and we haven't necessarily had a chance to put that in the root zone, right? So right now, the crop is probably relying on whatever nitrogen was there at planting still, or being released from the organic matter, right? So we really need some rainfall here shortly to really put the nitrogen in the root zone. In terms of other problems that we might face here later in the season, right? Most of the time, the biggest yield losses that we have are from stripe rust, followed by leaf rust. Again, so far, conditions have not been favorable for those diseases, owing to the dry conditions that we're having down south, right? So there's just not, the models that we have are not pointing out that we would have any concerns with that. And if indeed the long-term forecast of drier than normal conditions pan out, then it's probably one input that we can save some money on is not needing that fodder fungicide. So far, it seems like that's the way that the season is kind of turning out to be. Some of these dry seasons, we kind of have some concerns with viral diseases as well, right? That sometimes are spread out with some of those early plantings in the fall. Surprisingly, things have been a bit quiet this year. Catching up with our disease diagnostic lab here, they have not received the volume of samples that we usually do for wheat streak mosaic primarily, right? Or for other viral diseases either, right? As a reminder, those diseases, they have been increasing. They were historically contained to Western Kansas. More recently, we're seeing a lot of them out in Central Kansas as well. But this year, for some reason, excuse me, we have not seen as many samples come in, right? So far, a year where we are standing at a good potential, a good stand establishment, a crop that has a very good potential now if the weather conditions collaborate. But the crop is growing, starting to grow and take off. We will increase the water demand by this crop. If we don't have some water come down soon, right, we will have the issues of first not having the fertilizer put out in the root zone, but more importantly, not matching crop water demand that is really increasing very fast right now as the crop takes off. So even though we're standing at a good potential at the moment, if we don't have some moisture to hold that potential, things can go downhill fairly quick.
Well, Dr. Lollato, as always, we appreciate the time that you take to talk about how this wheat crop is going. I'm sure we'll have probably at least one more conversation with you, either on the wheat tour that'll be coming up here in May, or as we get closer to harvest, and kind of your observations as you traverse the state and see how things may turn out. So again, appreciate your time.
Absolutely, Ken. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to sharing some thoughts with your listeners here.
Dr. Romulo Lollato, wheat and forage system specialist at K-State Research and Extension, joining us. We'll take a break, come back with more in a moment.
The Kansas Wheat Innovation Center in Manhattan is rediscovering ways to get improved varieties and new genetics in the hands of farmers faster. Grower-led and checkoff-funded research initiatives are bringing about positive change. This grassroots leadership provides a strong voice in Topeka and Washington, D.C. Now is the time to partner with Kansas Wheat in moving wheat forward. Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. Farmers investing in their future and yours. Log on to rediscoverwheat.org.
Well, growing conditions in corn obviously rely on rain. We have no irrigation. We rely completely on Mother Nature and rain. The biggest impacts are on the drought side. If you don't get the rain, it is a major impact on how much corn we can grow. If it rains too much, that gets back to our seed technology and applying fungicide and insecticide, which is something that can be applied by sprayers to help that from like funguses growing like you see in your yards or gardens or anything, to where it can really affect and make the corn, say, moldy. How we monitor our corn growth is 2 or 3 different ways. A lot of it is walking through the field and literally looking at it with your eyes and in your hand, pulling the shucks back and looking at it. That's one part of it. We also use technology. We utilize that technology. That also helps us monitor our fertilizer levels, and it'll kind of give us projections as well. A sprayer is an applicator. You can put on chemicals, insecticide, fungicide, which are all things that have to be applied over the top of a crop. When I say chemicals, herbicide, that is a product that kills weeds. When we apply chemical, you see the big tank on our sprayer. The majority of that is water in there. The water is the additive we used when we apply chemical. The herbicide we add into our tank is a minimal amount versus the entire tank of water. They have to be applied in a certain time frame. They have to be applied at a certain growing stage. So a sprayer basically is there to help prevent weeds, kill weeds, and prevent a problem. If we over-applied, it would do nothing but hurt the ground. It would hurt the farmer. It would not be good for anybody. No farmer wants to lose this technology, because one of the biggest struggles we have is keeping the ground clean. So we apply things right, and we do it right, because if we don't, we're going to lose it.
Premier Farm and Home has what you need to make your lawn the best in the neighborhood.
Hi, I'm Ken. We choose Premier Farm and Home for the professional look that we do ourselves.
Feel free to stop in. You can also visit our website at heycow.com.
The Leadership KFB program really matters because it's giving us all the tools to bring home leadership to our own communities and to keep rural Kansas thriving. And they give you opportunities that you would not normally have in your everyday life.
During time as Leadership KFB Class 10, one of the things I've come to appreciate is the folks in Washington and Topeka that are fighting for us out here.
You get to meet with leaders from the industry, leaders from outside of the industry, and some unique agriculturalists throughout the state of Kansas.
It helped me to understand my personality and why I work the way that I work, and really to hone in on my strengths and weaknesses so that I can be a better advocate for agriculture.
One thing I've learned about is that each person can make a difference in issues that they care about through engagement or just activity, or being the one to stand up and say, I'll do that, or I'll take care of that.
You get to travel across the state of Kansas, see how agriculture is done in different places, technology, the way our food is produced, shipped, processed.
I've always been extremely proud of farming and ranching in Western Kansas and choosing to live rural after going to Kansas State University. But it really wasn't until Leadership KFB that I realized the importance of thinking outside the box, sitting around with a group of leaders and challenging each other in our thought.
Throughout the year with Leadership KFB, I took a lot of notes. But I think the most impactful note that I took was a speaker telling our class to serve others, lead well, and grow continuously.
What does a brighter, more sustainable future look like in our cities and towns, and how do we get there? When New York needed an alternative fuel source to reduce carbon emissions, the city found what it needed in biodiesel made from U.S. soybean oil.
As the prescribed burning season gets underway, landowners should familiarize themselves with the information available on ksfire.org and the KS Flint Hills Smoke Management page on Facebook. Tools are available in both locations to help make burn time decisions that minimize the impact of smoke on urban areas. The success of this voluntary approach is important to preventing regulation of burning by the Environmental Protection Agency. Among key elements available for use are 2 forecast models on the website. The Cumulative Fire Impact Map predicts potential smoke contributions from each county to air quality in urban areas. The second model shows the direction and extent of the predicted smoke plume from a single burn based on variables provided by the user. An animated map displays smoke movement over the next 48 hours based on burn location, number of acres, and the estimated fuel load. Weather conditions also are provided to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of a planned burn. Last year, nearly 1.4 million acres were burned in 17 Kansas counties, making up the Kansas Flint Hills, up from 1.2 million in 2023. So far this year, more than 26,000 acres already have been burned.
This is Jacob Herzog with Pinion Risk Management. Now, this last week has been very busy and especially volatile for the equities. While in ag, on the other hand, although there has been some movement, doesn't really place us outside of the general ranges that we haven't already been trading over the past month or so. Now, starting off the week, there was a more or less uneventful USDA report that came out with numbers not wildly surprising for either the March 1st stock numbers nor the prospective acre planting numbers. Corn came in at 95.3 million acres, soybeans at 83.5, and all wheat came in at a combined 45.4. Now, moving on to the more exciting news that this last April 2nd, Liberation Day, as it is said by the White House, that there is now a baseline tariff of 10% on most all countries, and many countries have been singled out for higher rates. Now, these rates look more or less like half of their respective tariff that is on us. And there's also a list of goods that the reciprocal tariffs do not apply, such as gold, energy, lumber, pharmaceuticals, etc., that the White House specifies, quote, certain materials that are not available in the United States. Now, notably, Mexico and Canada did not receive any new tariffs on April 2nd. So, certainly the next few weeks will continue to be a whirlwind of headlines as some countries scramble to make a deal while other countries will hit back with their own counter tariffs. Now, I know it's kind of redundant to say, but it feels like there has never been such a fire hose of information as before. And with planting ahead of us, and with it more headlines of this and that spot of the country either getting or missing rain, as we potentially enter a weather market, it's going to make decision making harder and harder as time goes on. Now, think about a plan ahead of time. If you would like to talk to somebody about a plan, you can reach us at 888-452-8751. I'm Jacob Herzog with Pinion Risk Management.
What does a brighter, more sustainable future look like in our cities and towns, and how do we get there? When New York needed an alternative fuel source to reduce carbon emissions, the city found what it needed in biodiesel made from U.S. soybean oil.
Well, that'll do it for our program this week. Thank you so much for joining us. Be social with us online, KansasAgReport.net, or our social media channels. I'm Ken Rogers. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back with you again next week on the Kansas Ag Report.